Nick, did you know Martin Scorsese has a list of the 11 scariest movies of all time for him? There's some classics on there. There's some deep cuts. I mean, as Scorsese is wont to do.
Yeah.
His number one movie, though, is the film we're talking about today, Robert Wise's The Haunting.
The Haunting, which, before we talk about it, I think on the list is The Innocents, too, which is very similar. So,
Yeah, we'll
eventually.
probably just work our way through that eventually.
Yeah. Martin's got a theme. All right.
Yeah.
Time to get spooked.
Welcome back to the show, everybody. I'm one of your hosts, Kyle Goethe from GoatFilmReviews.com.
Hi, I'm Nick from the St. Paul Filmcast. Thanks for finding us. Thanks for watching. And for our loyal fans, sincerely, thank you for continuing to support the show. Hey, you can do us a solid by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. It's a little thing for you, but it's a big help for us. We do have a Patreon. Check that out for some great content and opportunities to tell us what movies we can review in the future. Both Kyle and I are members of the Minnesota Film Critics Alliance. Check out that webpage for critics' reviews as well as ours. And today we're talking about Scorsese's favorite, The Haunting.
Hill House has stood for 90 years, and it may well stand for 90 more. The house, which has been the locale for a number of unusual and tragic deaths, is now the home of Dr. Mark Way's research into the paranormal. He's gathered several people who can aid in his investigation, but when the house challenges them, is it ghosts or cabin fever?
This is The Haunting. It's based on a book by Shirley Jackson.
Yeah.
That book is titled The
Haunting of Hill House.
The Haunting of Hill House.
Very short novel, like 120 pages.
Yep. This movie got remade in I think 1999. Same title, and I think Catherine Zeta-Jones is in it. Liam Neeson.
Yeah, Jan de Bont, who was like hot off of Speed, and I guess you could say Speed 2, took on directing duties for that film.
Yeah. And from that remake, they discovered how they can do computer graphics, and it's overloaded with CGI. Just bombarded with.
Yeah, at the time, I remember the remake working for me, but I was also like 10. So, I imagine the CG and stuff didn't affect me in that way, but it does tend to age. What's fascinating about the remake, too, is that it almost ended up being a co-production between Spielberg and Stephen King. They had worked for several years on trying to remake The Haunting or do a new adaptation, and eventually they decided they just could not find a good rhythm between the two of them. Stephen King went off to make a great miniseries out of his idea called Rose Red, which if you haven't had a chance to check out, it's a great miniseries. I think it's like a 4-hour miniseries. Totally worth your time. It's great.
It's funny that after Saving Private Ryan that he wanted to do like The Haunting with Stephen King.
Yeah, Spielberg's always been kind of like circling horror, and he just never really finds time when he can, jump in and do it. But he's just always wanted to do it. So
yeah, right. So it came out. The book came out, I think, 5 years before this movie, and it's directed by Robert Wise, which is interesting. Robert Wise movies kind of like he doesn't really have a signature. He's really one of those almost like Richard Donner. He really wants to capture the mood of the movie more than having his own signature style in place.
Yeah, I like that you say that though, because when I found out that the guy who did The Sound of Music also did
West Side Story.
West Side Story, he did Star Trek The Motion Picture, which that's maybe the biggest jump for me. But then you get things like The Day the Earth Stood Still, which I love. Like he's done all these really
You put a Robert Wise collection, you're like, this doesn't seem to fit. Right.
Yeah, but this one I feel like at least goes back to his early days, because for those of you that don't know, his first major gig was working on the sequel to Cat People, The Curse of the Cat People.
Curse of the Cat People, yes. If I want to interrupt you just for a second. Yeah, if you want to go back, we talked about Val Luton with Cat People, and then how he hired pretty much nobodies and worked on their skills, and Robert Wise is one of them. He just, all right, you're really good at editing, now I'm going to give you a movie to do and all that stuff. So
and I really dig that sequel, so we'll eventually have to talk about that on the show.
Yeah.
But, I mean, in many ways, he'd said that The Haunting was his homage, his tribute to Val Luton, who died, about a decade prior. Yeah. But he wanted to make a movie that would showcase, like, here's where I started, because of you, I'm still going back to that horror world. I'm still going back to that, ooky world. And it's really cool to see that he's jumping along with that.
Yeah, because it's shot, and we'll get a little bit to the aesthetics when we do a review. It's shot very much like noir horror, like Val Newton's RKO movies, like The Seventh Victim and Curse the Cat People, and Cat People too.
Yep, and some of that was out of his hands because there was a mandate that the film had to be black and white, which I think is always very interesting during that transitionary period when you had some black and white films and some color, that certain producers were just like, no, every movie I make is going to be this way or that way.
Well, when I looked up research and I see there was Columbia Pictures, we know Columbia Pictures in the 50s and 60s, it's going to be cheap and it's going to be 90 minutes, and that's it.
Yeah, and even though this film was originally conceived as a B-side picture. It actually played in most A feature roles during these double plays because of the studio's pride in the finished product. Didn't help the box office. The film actually ended up losing some money, but it did kind of earn the A status, which was tough for a horror film at that time.
Right, yeah. So you have Robert Wise, and then really kind of interesting, you have Richard Johnson.
Yeah.
Who came very close for doing James Bond. We talked about him when we created the movie Zombie. He was in the movie Zombie. And they did Zombie on The Last Drive-In with Joe Bob Briggs. It was pretty funny.
Oh, yeah.
But Richard Johnson, he's very close to almost doing James Bond, and he's kind of like the circus manager for all the craziness going on.
Yeah, a role that I think you really have to kind of do something special with because it's a very expository role in just about every interpretation of this story.
I love that word.
But he comes in and he makes it his own. He provides a lot of the tone and mood of the dialogue throughout the film. I think he's better at providing dread than even Eleanor or Theo or any of the other characters because he's able to twist that exposition into being the mood piece of the film. And it's one of the, I loved when I saw him in Zombie because I was like, oh my God, it's Markway again. He's doing more crazy doctor stuff.
And then rounding out, you have Russ Tamblyn. I think it's Amber Tamblyn's dad, right?
Yeah, because in the film Django Unchained, he played something gunslinger, and she played daughter of the gunslinger. They both did cameo appearances in that film. But yeah, they are related.
And then Russ Tamblyn, if you recognize him, he's also in West Side Story. And then you have round out the female characters who played Elizabeth and Theo.
Yeah, so Eleanor was Julie Harris, who I've seen in a couple of things, but not very big roles. And Theodora was Claire Bloom as well. I think neither actress really reached the heights of the two male actors in the production.
And you get this very Gilligan Islands. One's very glamorous and one's very, dressed up. Yeah.
And the interesting thing about it was, Julie Harris, while she was working on the film, she actually was suffering from depression, much like her character. So that kind of aids in some of the, I'm not saying that you should have depression if you want to play depressed characters, but it did aid the performance, I think, in kind of making her a very tragic character who very easily could have been similar to 5 years later Night of the Living Dead's Barbara, who's a character I've never really been big on. Julie Harris is able to bring something different to Eleanor's kind of hysteria.
Interesting point out. Because Night of the Living Dead came out just a couple years after this one. It's interesting, 63. We really don't have an entity horror monster. We did entity horror monsters like Dracula and stuff in the 30s and 40s. In the 50s, 60s, almost like from outer space, blobs, or a ghost or anything.
It was kind of a lossless time for horror, really. I mean, because we had carryover, because it was like all these Hammer horror films that started in the 50s were still kind of doing their thing, but we brought in like psychological stuff, we brought in ghosts, we brought in some of the leftover 50s monster movies. It wasn't really until like the end of the 60s that we started to find a new attitude of what our horror was going to be, and then that carried into the 70s. It's a very lossless time though, where everyone's just making everything.
And then that would come back to like, we need a person, we need an entity, like something physical that's doing the monsters. Monster need to come back.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. The Haunting is I think it's psychologically more of a I'm going to try to say it's more psychologically than more than just an entity's coming after you, like the Blob or something like that.
That was the big disconnect, too, I think, between Shirley Jackson and the screenwriter Nelson Gidding, was that Gidding saw a lot more of the psychological traits. He didn't even see it really as a ghost story, but as a kind of a cabin fever and psychological breakdown.
You're punking yourself, right?
Yeah, whereas Jackson was very much like, no, it's a ghost story. Like, this is a ghost story. It just happens to have those themes as well. And there was that little bit of that disconnect. And you can tell Gidding's screenplay does focus heavily on the psychological, but it doesn't hide those ghost story elements either.
No. Well, we critiqued the movie with George C. Scott in the Haunting.
The Changeling, yeah.
The Changeling. You don't get The Changeling without this movie.
Yeah, that's true. Another film on Scorsese's list, too.
The Changeling? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, that's a little bit about the background of it. If you don't really understand when I talked about RKO films, I really dive into RK films and then understand where this movie comes from. All those horror movie noirs from the late 40s and how it influenced to get this movie made and how the aesthetics comes.
I think it's one of the first films of like a kid who grew up on these types of movies making his movie, like how Spielberg did that. Yeah. He grew up on those old serials and then he would go and make a Raiders of the Lost Ark. We kind of had that for the first time with Robert Wise, who grew up and kind of owned his skills in the system and then basically made a film that's like 30 years old for 1963.
Yeah, it kind of seems weird because it seems like it says 1963, but if you look at it without any information, you're like, this is like late 40s, isn't it?
Yeah, I saw a lot of elements, especially like for me, it was a lot of stuff that I'd seen in the 50s that had been like re-owned, reshaped, learned from the mistakes. Because I saw a lot of things like, House on Haunted Hill and, these kind of, the William Castle films, but done with a bit more of charm and respect, I guess.
One of the fascinating things is it's a very full movie set. Mm-hmm. It is highly decorated. Even the doorknobs are decorated. It is overly decorated, which is interesting for a Columbia picture, which likes to do just basic.
Yeah.
Because we talked about the Big Heat, how it's pretty much stripped of anything making the film. It's very boring movie set. But this one, it is luscious. It is busy everywhere.
Yeah, the production design was done by Elliot Scott, actually, who would later go on to do films like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Set decoration was done by John Jarvis, and they just packed the film to the gills. I think the intention was also to make sure the sets, because it was sets of the interior, would have ceilings that would be low enough to be visible on camera, so that everything you'd see in the shot would be everything in the room, and it would just have that claustrophobic squeeze.
Compact. Everything's compact. Even the shots are compact. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And since you have 4 characters, sometimes 5, in a room jammed in, it always feels like there's nowhere to move. There's nowhere to get out. And I think that kind of aids that mood a little bit.
Interesting, because when you watch it, it's supposed to be in this huge mansion that has lots of space, but it's never shot that way. It looks like I can't escape, and if I run, I'm gonna hit something, knock something over. Right.
Yeah, it's got a good juxtaposition between, because it was shot at the exterior was Eddington Park, which is actually now a hotel. You can stay at the hotel.
All right.
Eddington Park was where they shot the exterior, but of course it was interior set wise. It's fascinating that the idea was actually kind of a pre-Shining, where they had characters leaving a room in one way and they would exit into a different doorway.
Interesting.
And so there would be that kind of lossless idea of where are we at in the house. People have tried mapping the house. It doesn't exactly fit. And at the time they thought it was mistakes. And then later on would kind of come to realize, no, this was intentional. It was because it was such a big house. Something that Kubrick would get a lot of credit for with The Shining later on was done here.
Yeah, very much a launch pad for a lot of other horror movies we see in the future, but also a stepping stone of what came before it, aesthetically and shot. So it's almost like in the middle of where we're going to go in the future and where it came from.
Yeah, there's a seemingly a choice to go backwards with certain elements and then reach forward with others. And that's, I think, where the film kind of gets that lossless, timeless appeal, is that if you ask me, I'm pretty good with movie release dates. If you ask me when this movie came out, I'd say most days out of the week, I'd probably say the 50s or the 40s.
Yeah.
It's just where my mind sits with it. But it is kind of outside of all that time period. And maybe it's because there's no technology either being used.
With that car chase, the car crash, they really so much wanted to do a decapitation, but it's 1963. They can't really show it, but they really wanted to do it with the car crash.
And that goes back to the Robert Wise of it all, is that he's done some really, big scale kind of stuff in his career, and then to have a film where he's so squeezed into a box kind of creates that idea of, now we've got to make it work. We've got to make, kind of work around it a bit. And the changes made from the end of the novel are interesting. They don't really add or take away, but they showcase that he has a unique perspective on the material. As we discussed before, this film was, Robert Wise jumped into this actually while he was in post on West Side Story. So imagine doing a film that's in black and white horror ghost story after
and you do this wide scope in Technicolor musical, right? Yeah.
Yeah. This has always been a movie for me. I like the movie. I don't love the movie just because of certain choices made with the horror. It kind of skirts a little bit around these ideas of, is it real, is it not real? And those kinds of tropes don't really work for me that much. I like to see the monster behind the closet door. But it's just done so well that I love the atmosphere that I'm seeing when I'm watching it. So it's kind of that dual ideas of me. Is I wish I loved it more, but I'm so entranced when I see it.
It's really emphasizing on the psychological component rather than what is really behind the curtain. We're not going to ever see the wizard behind the curtain.
Yeah.
But it's also supposed to. I'm using the Wizard of Oz metaphor. You're supposed to punk yourself as you're making your way to see the wizard, but you're never going to see him.
Yeah.
And you're frightening yourself out to where you almost punking yourself. The hand thing is important because Elizabeth feels like she's thought somebody's holding her hand, but she's never close to anybody holding her hand. Mm-hmm. And you can translate that the entity really, this house really spooked her to think that, or she's just so out of it that she's manifesting these things in her mind. And I think that's the play of the whole movie, is you're manifesting this or is it really happening?
Yeah.
And it really tries to dance on it without providing answers, which could frustrate people.
Yeah.
I understand it could frustrate a lot of people that you don't get a result to this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a specific brain wavelength that you have to be on, I think, to appreciate the film. And I
Yeah.
do like that it feels like a proper adaptation of the book. The book is one of those books I read every other year around the Halloween season. I read it quite often.
And it's
I read it more than I
short,
see
right?
any film. Yeah, because it's just a quick, like, I can get through it in a couple days. I just go back to it because I find it so fascinating. But it is a lot of in Eleanor's head. It is a lot of in her thoughts, and the film gets that too.
Yeah.
One thing that I think the adaptation does better than the book, or maybe because the book wasn't trying to, is it creates that sense of paranoia, I guess, in Eleanor's character, in that she's not really sure if Markway is doing some of the things to set her up, or she's not sure if, if these characters are kind of after her. And I think it builds on that kind of paranoia really well in a way that the 1999 remake would take too far, because they had it set up as though Liam Neeson's character was basically purposely creating the horrors, whereas
Right.
we like the idea of it not being certain.
Yes, and then you get the backstory a little bit about the old lady that's taken care of, but then she wasn't really taken care of. But you never really see the death. You see her like tapping the wall.
Yep.
So this is very much haunting. It's very much your mind is supposed to fill in the blanks of what you're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
You never really see the old lady die. You never really see, the dangers. Your mind is supposed to fill in the blanks. You see a lot of the door being warped and everything like that. And then you get the play of, well, the door is never shut on her own, but when he demonstrates it, it doesn't work.
Yep. But
And
then
so-
when they walk back up to it a moment later, it did.
It did. So it's always like, are you BSing me? Or that was a chance to really tell me and you missed the opportunity. So it's almost, that's an interesting point of the movie, because it's all part of the movie. It's like, are you really playing on me or I'm not?
Yeah.
And it's hard to decipher.
And it's one of those elements that makes it then, where even if you had film mistakes in the movie, they work because they add to that confusion level of, wait, that door was supposed to be open, that door was supposed to be closed. It kind of aids and rolls in itself. It's almost a mistake-proof movie in that way, because every mistake you made would just be part
Emphasis
of the,
demonstrated what you wanted to do in the first place.
Yeah.
I really like the choices of how, we talked about it in our background, how Robert shot this movie. Usually when you shoot a mansion, you want to show off a little bit about the decorations, do wide scope, but you never see that. You just see it in the background. You never see the scale of the mansion. We understand it's big, you can get lost in it, but you never shoot it that way. A lot of it is very people up front. There's a forced perspective of Elizabeth and then somebody in the background coming in. And so you have a lot of this very compact shot scene. Even in the dining room scene, which you thought you might would go wide scope, but you don't. Then you get a wide scope in the movie Batman, the Michael Keaton Batman, when he's at dinner.
Yeah.
And it's for the
comedic
gag.
effect,
It's a gag,
Yeah.
right? How the dinner. But for them, they have almost the same table, but you never shot far away.
Yeah. It adds to the claustrophobia. It adds to the... and what I really appreciate, though, is that even though everything is purposely in a square box,
Yeah.
your eyes wander to, like, the busts of the different heads and, like, the things in there because you think they're moving. You're not sure if they're moving, so you want to check them every time the camera cuts back to them. And it's kind of funny because, again, in the 90s remake, the heads did move a lot more on the bus, and there was kind of like that idea.
Yeah, and
that,
then because, showing off the CGI.
yeah, but the 2018 TV adaptation, which is really a completely different thing, but set in that house, there was the whole joke going on that when you'd watch the 2018 television version, there was always ghosts hidden in the darkness. And so every episode had hidden ghosts. Like you'd see in like the background this silhouette, or you'd see a hand on the door. And it's just like you'd look for that stuff in the film. This one didn't have that, and you find that you're still looking for it.
Yeah. So you have a lot of these trope movies where strangers who never met before come into a house and troubles ensue. So you have a lot of, even Clue like this. You get into a mansion and something awful is going to happen. And these people don't really know each other, but you understand that one of them has a background that you just haven't figured out yet.
Yeah. I
And
like
it's-
that each character brings that to the table, though.
And this is not yet to become a cliche, but after this movie, it becomes a cliche that's been used many times over. You go to the mansion to figure out, and you don't really know anybody, but you know something's going to happen.
Yeah. But you have an interesting spectrum of characters, because you do have Eleanor, who is the character that we're meant to identify with. She's the one who's kind of on the open, and she's just constantly beaten down by the world, and she spent her whole life beaten down. But then on the juxtaposition, you have
that drive to the
know,
place is yeah.
Yeah, but you have Theodora as well, who actually is one of the first lesbian characters in film, especially one of the ones that's seen as a
Is
real
she in the book?
feminine character. It's hinted at in the book.
Okay.
It's never explicitly stated kind of how it is here. But this is one of the first interpretations of a lesbian character where she's not seen as a predatory character because of the views at the time.
Right. Back then, if you're gay, you're predatory.
You're after everyone else.
Yeah,
you want to flip everyone else.
Yeah.
But then I think Russ Tamblin's version of Luke is fascinating, and I might prefer his version of Luke to the book version, which is very much the same character, but the idea that he wants to try and make as much money off the house as possible, and the only reason he's there is because he's being forced to be there for his inheritance. I really like that interpretation of it.
Sounds like a character in Barbarian, doesn't it?
Yeah, kind of, yeah. Yeah, but Russ Tamblyn almost said no like several times to the film because he thought, well, it's just kind of a very plain character. I don't really like that character. I mean, I know I worked with Robert on West Side
It does perceive
Story.
as plain, right?
Yeah, but the way he does it, and in fact, he's gone back at saying it's his favorite performance he's ever given, his favorite character, his favorite film to work on. And when you have that from a guy that's worked on West Side Story or someone who has worked frequently with David Lynch, I mean, he was the doctor in Twin Peaks.
Yes, that's right.
It's great to see that he's like, no, this is it. This horror film is the one I look back on most.
I like that great entrance when he comes in making drinks and the lady's like, he goes, right, I know, not enough for move.
Yeah.
I love it. It's a good fun.
And then they even get at the spirits joke early. Don't make fun of my interest in spirits.
Yeah.
And Tamblyn actually came back for a cameo in the 2018 television series as well. He plays the Nellie's doctor. So yeah.
You're trying to entice me to watch that movie again.
Oh, you got to check out that series, man. That series is great.
The series, I've yet to see the series. If you have seen the series, or if you want to continue the series, add a comment down below or something like that to keep the conversation going about the haunting. Mm-hmm. But I do like the notions that this is a stepping stone of what it came from and what was going to happen in the future. You get a lot of cliches of the same kind of platform of this movie. Even then, you don't get Clue without this, right? Mm-hmm. And then where it came from the noirs of the 40s and RKOs, working cheaply, and then Columbia Pictures working cheaply. It's a 90-minute movie because it's Columbia Pictures tape line, so it's not a very drawn-out film. Mm. But I understand that people who love horrors, you're not going to get the answers that you want, and that gets frustrating.
Yeah, and it's kind of amalgamated in with things like The House on Haunted Hill or The Legend of Hell House, where these like stories, like because they all kind of have very similar titles, very similar interpretations, have kind of steamrolled into being their own micro genre. One thing I appreciate that the film focuses on things like sound work, that it focuses on things like mood and atmosphere. But whenever they show some of these really incredible special effects for the time period, I'm just so entranced. That door flexing is one of the coolest things I've ever seen in a ghost story.
Right. I don't really want to know how they did it.
It's amazing.
It's kind of see how, but I want to keep the magic for that. I don't want to find out how they actually did it.
Yeah. But things like the cold spot, where they actually like tried to create a cold spot, they actually used filters on the characters as they walked up to it so that they would look a little bit more pale as they got into it. Yeah. I think it's just, there's some really incredible filmmaking techniques on there that aren't even really done all that much today, but the fact that they were done back then in this kind of, again, like timeless film is just so fascinating to me. And I wish there was more of it, because the sound stuff is interesting, it's cool, but there's so much of the sound stuff. There's so much of the knocking on the doors.
And the walking.
And the walking.
Yeah.
It's effective. I think it would have been more effective if it was interspersed with some of those interesting effects.
And the set decoration is kind of a star in the movie.
Yeah.
Because it enhances, like, who puts a full-fed statue on the new post for the stairs? This elaborate set, like, am I supposed to touch that? I mean, you're right, yeah.
Yeah.
It fits into this. Is that thing's going to move or what? It's all part of the aesthetic of the movie, as you question everything around you.
The fact that there's not been a spoof satire film called Hoarders Hill House Edition, where a bunch of hoarding experts go into this place and like get picked off. The fact that we haven't done that as a society is shocking.
All right, Reagan have to write the treatment for that.
One thing I'm so happy about that Robert Wise chose to do is, back in the 90s, of course, you had Ted Turner owning the film, and he was going through and colorizing every damn black and white film he had.
Right. Yep.
Robert Wise was pissed about this. He said, if I'd made the film in color, I would have wanted it in color. If I made it in black and white, I wanted it in black and white. And he actually presented his contract for the film, which required that the finished product be black and white as legal proof to stop Ted Turner from colorizing it is kind of hilarious, and I love him for it.
And I think that's one of the reasons why he stopped doing it, because it was always a feature late at night at TCM. See the Maltese Falcon in color. Why? Right.
Yeah, it was a fun gimmick for a while, kind of like 3D, where like when it comes up again for a couple years, you're like, it's pretty neat, and then you realize it's not really doing anything to the movie.
It's like MTV Unplugged. Hey, that was fun for like 2 years.
Yeah.
And then after that, knock it off.
If you had shot the film in color and then converted it to black and white, and then you wanted to try a version in color, I'm fine with that. Because they do that a lot with color films in black and white. Nightmare Alley did that. Mad Max Fury Road, The Mist, they all had black and white versions. I'm okay with experimenting with it that way. But if the film was shot in black and white, don't paint things. It's really odd. Although it is weird that they go to the purple room in the film, and they talk about how purple it is, and it's black and white, so you can't see it.
It's one of my favorite things I get a chuckle at is when they talk color in black and white.
Yeah, we're like, it's so purple, it's so drab and lovely, and it's like, I need to know.
Right. Okay, what do you think of our review of The Haunting? What do you think of it as well? Keep the conversation going, like and subscribe, tell your friends about the show.
Yeah, let us know your favorite version of the film. There's two films. There's the TV show, or if you're just the book person, you just like the book and hate everything else, let us know in the comments section. We'd love to engage with you all over there. Thank you guys for joining us. You can check out all those links Nick mentioned down in the comments, and you can find all of my film reviews over at goatfilmreviews.com.
Where is that?
goatfilmreviews.com.
All right. And you can find my show, the St. Paul Filmcast, anywhere you find podcasts. And we are starting again new episodes. So check that out.
Before you watch any others, you got to watch our mid-year review, where we talked about, I think, more than 10 films that I really loved. So check out that episode, and then watch everything else on that playlist.
Yeah.
We'll see you guys next time.